Welcome to the White House. We will be live streamed at whitehouse.gov/live. And for those of you who are going to live tweet during this, including those who are joining us online, the hashtag is WHChamps and Open Science. And so we also want you to check out online whitehouse.gov/champions for more information on the champions that you're going to hear today for Open Science. And what I'd like to do now is introduce you to John Holdren, the President's Science Advisor and the Director of OSTP, who is also a champion for change on open science. And you'll hear more about that right now. Dr. Holdren.
Well, thank you, Mike, and let me add my welcome to the White House to his. And indeed, that's really on behalf of President Obama, all of us in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, everybody in the White House working to advance the science, technology, and innovation agenda for the benefit of the whole country. We really all want to congratulate the newly minted champions of change, from whom you'll be hearing very shortly. But these folks are leaders, they're thinkers, they're dreamers, they're creators, without whom this essential work of opening up the scientific enterprise would really not get accomplished. And I mean it when I say it really is an impressive bunch, and you'll be experiencing that here. I also want to welcome all the scientists and innovators and entrepreneurs in the audience, those tuning in online, joining for our celebration today of open science and the tremendous value that open science brings to our economy and to our society. As you all know better than anybody, the proposition behind open science is a simple one. More value is derived from scientific results when more people can access and use them. We've seen time and again that scientific research supported by the federal government can spur scientific breakthroughs, economic opportunities, when the results are made freely available. Open weather data generated by government satellites, for example, fuels the forecasting industry, provides enormous public benefits ranging from the crucial work of predicting the paths of hurricanes to the everyday task of helping us decide whether to carry an umbrella to work. Other types of open data are fueling an entire global positioning system economy, accelerating advances in biomedicine, underpinning countless other tools and services that are the basis of revenue-generating products and job-creating companies. And we believe it's our job in this administration to support this kind of openness, innovation, and growth by promoting policies that will further encourage open access to scientific data and publications generated with public money. The information generated in that way belongs to the American people, and we should be doing everything we can to make it available for leveraging by people across the society to accelerate scientific progress and economic growth. President Obama, I can assure you, understands this proposition as well as anybody. In fact, on his first day in office, he set the tone for his administration in this respect by signing an open government memorandum calling on all federal departments and agencies to be more transparent. Since then, the Office of Science and Technology Policy has been working diligently to solicit broad public input and convene the best minds around how to make scientific research results more open and more accessible. As many of you know, the public dialogue on this topic reached a high point when more than 60,000 people signed a White House We the People petition expressing their clear desire for increased access to the results of taxpayer-funded scientific research. By that time, we had already had a very public process underway to develop an open access policy, but, well, how can I say this? It was good to know we had so much widespread support looking at those 60,000 signatures. I should mention here that 4 people who were instrumental to building momentum around that petition are here with us today. Mike Carroll, Heather Joseph, Mike Rossner, and John Wilbanks. Would you stand, please, just to be recognized? I would say these folks acted as megaphones for a resounding public call to make the results of taxpayer-funded research freely available online, and of course that call was heard loud and clear, and we responded. Building on the persistent work of our staffers at OSTP and the broad input they gathered through multiple convenings and solicitations, this past February, I directed federal agencies with more than $100 million in R&D expenditures to develop plans for expanding access to research results and scientific data. By the end of this summer, they will all have draft policies in place, laying out the concrete steps that they will take to make that happen. In addition to that, just last month, President Obama issued a landmark executive order making the default status of government data open and machine readable. I'm certain that Todd Park will have more to say about that a little later this afternoon. So we have been working hard here in Washington to promote open science, but we know that the innovation and the opportunities that are the end game of these efforts can only happen when people like you step up to the plate, or I should say, when you stay in the game, because as I mentioned, you've already made your presence at the plate pretty widely and effectively known for some time now. And today's champions are doing that. The champions have opened access to realms as diverse as archaeology, biomedicine, astronomy, and medieval writings. They have worked tirelessly to generate, promote, and use open scientific data as fuel for new products, successful businesses, and game-changing scientific insights. And as proud as I am of the administration's commitments to open science, I know you're all eager to hear from the champions themselves who have taken this philosophy and have run with it. So I'll wrap up by once again saying congratulations and expressing thanks on behalf of the President and really for all of the American people for the important work that the champions and you here in this room have done and continue to do. I'll also take this opportunity to invite all in the room to attend an open science poster session following this event, co-sponsored by the Mozilla Foundation, where, in the spirit of openness, we can all learn from one another's work in the open science space. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Holdren. So, without further ado, let's bring up our first panel of champions. Everyone, first panel of champions. David Lippman from the National Institutes of Health, Paul Ginsberg from Cornell University, Drew Endy from Stanford University, Eric Kanza from Open Context at UC Berkeley, David Altshuler on behalf of the Global Alliance for Sharing Genomic and Clinical Data from the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT, and Stephen Friends from Sage Bionetworks. So what we're going to do to start off is just hear the story of each one of these champions and what exactly they did to drive open science and how they're using open science data and publications to improve our world. With that, I'm going to just start right away with David. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. I'm here representing the National Center for Biotechnology Information, which is part of the National Library of Medicine at the National Institutes of Health. One of the first open science databases was GenBank. Over 30 years ago, a group of leading scientists from around the world saw the seemingly exploding number of DNA sequences. Now we wouldn't even notice. We get more sequences in a few seconds than they were getting then. But still, they saw the need for a database to share these sequences so that really everybody could make new discoveries with other people's data, which is what open science is about. They went to the leadership of NIH, Ruth Kirstein in particular, and they convinced her that this database should be funded and started, but it should have this principle that all the data should be made available to everybody. NCBI is responsible for this database. All the public DNA sequences go into the database, and scientists are downloading tremendous amounts of data from it every day. In fact, from all of our databases on the order of 30 terabytes every day, but they're also contributing 4 terabytes of data every day. Tremendous community involvement. The other database that we are responsible for is directly related to what Dr. Holdren was talking about, which is PubMed Central. That's a database of the full text articles in biomedical research. It contains all of the NIH-funded papers, and that represents the knowledge in biology. So to make progress in biological research, you need the data, but you also need the knowledge, which is still in those papers. That database is used by almost 1 million people a day, and they're downloading almost 2 million articles every day. So it's exciting to be here, and I look forward to hearing what the other champions have to say.
Thank you, David. Drew Endy.
Thanks, Mike. I'd like to ask you to imagine Abraham Lincoln composing the Gettysburg Address 77 years ago. But he had to get a license to use each of those words. He had to get permission because Mike owned the uses of the word score. And in fact, it was actually worse than that. He had to double check because similar words that had 75% of the letters being the same had to be checked. So if somebody else, for example, had owned, let's say, an opening stanza, 4 spore and 7 beers ago, you would need to get permission from those people too. And it just
I
wouldn't
think that might be
work.
the quote of the day so far, by the way.
Well, we don't know what the meaning of the address would have been. We know it might have been shorter still than that wonderful speech. Why open with this from me? When you think about composing in biology, I'm an engineer of biology, you see, we have to put together the words of biology in new ways, the genes, all these wonderful things that are available as information, but now we need to reuse them in novel combinations. Let's say I'd like to compose a piece of genetic poetry that programs a therapeutic cell to detect a tumor, to decide, are you really at the tumor, and then go invade and make the therapy and take it out. You can imagine I've got to select genetic words, biochemical words, and it's almost impossible to get permission to put words together in novel combinations. Just the transaction costs are very, very high. A number of us years ago, confronting this as immigrants to biotechnology, Randy Redberg, now at iGEM, Tom Knight, then at MIT, recognized that we were going to have to build a new framework for sharing based on open exchange of uses of genetic functions. And so we started a public benefit charity called the BioBricks Foundation, which is a very lightweight organization to develop open technical standards and legal tools, which I might announce later, that support the sharing and free-to-use exchange of genetically encoded functions. There's a whole separate conversation as, are you for or against getting better at programming life? And I'll defer that. I'm for getting better, and I think getting better in a way that engages people on an open basis is a positive thing to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Paul Ginsberg.
So I'd like to put in my pitch for the involvement of physicists here. In 1991, I was confronted with the following situation. We had started sharing some of our research information by email. This was somewhat before the rest of the planet had discovered the internet. And it occurred to me that it was a strikingly unfair situation, that there were a few of us who had privileged access to information, receiving it from our friends, and we're a very egalitarian community. It disturbed us if we make some important, if we're responsible for some important development or progress, we like to think it's because, say, we were smarter or because we worked harder, not because we had privileged access to inside information. And my solution to that in the pre-World Wide Web days was to set up an open access database where physicists could deposit their information. It started out as something for a few hundred of my colleagues. We all knew each other. And it was so popular, it grew like crazy and became a permanent archive, still exists 22 years later. It had an immediate positive effect, even back in the 91 to 93 period, of democratizing the flow of information for the research community worldwide. That is, the people in the third world who had problems accessing the journals because they were expensive, or in the former Soviet Union, regularly emailed to me how important the system was to them. And once it went online, with the World Wide Web, the growth was even faster. Incidentally, the World Wide Web, of course, was also also came out of the physics community. 1995 was named the year of the internet by Newsweek, and that's when the general public started to sign on en masse. And I point out that the incoming freshman at Cornell University this fall will have been born in 1995. And that is to say, we have a generation of people who've been living and breathing the internet and the World Wide Web. So currently, we're receiving about 100,000 news submissions per year. It's become the primary information feed for multiple global communities in physics, mathematics, increasingly in computer science. And it's a proof of concept, what people can do if they have open access to a large-scale text repository. It's facilitated progress within the community, and it's the prototype for many of the modern open access systems that we're working with, and something of a miracle that it's still around.
Paul, how many papers are in archive right now?
Over 1 million. And with an accelerated growth rate. And so back in the 90s, I discussed with people in NSF, DOE, making these kinds of open access initiatives, expanding the amount of material that it should be a requirement. I was thrilled to see here Walter Warnick, who was involved in Pub Science at the time, and we'll hope that expands as well with the recent initiative. It's a very positive step. We're all enthusiastic about it, and very much looking forward to having that 1-year time delay shortened sooner rather than later. There are important benefits to the general public. A few people came up to me to say how much they enjoy having access to articles that are even outside of their field of interest before we started this session. And we see it in our access logs. We can see when the general public comes in, because suddenly we get tens of thousands, millions of requests for articles that are referred by blogs and by newspapers. So there's been important involvement, and again, with the general principles, the general public has paid for it, they deserve access. So we have benefits to the public. We're trying to provide, as I mentioned, the proof of concept of what you can do if you have a comprehensive database, openly accessible, no artificial boundaries, that covers an entire field, organizes a global research community, and hope that it provides a model to spread to other areas.
Thank you so much. David Altshuler.
Thanks for the chance.
From MIT, Broad,
Bunch
Harvard.
of places. Thanks for the chance to be here today. I want to actually pick up on what Drew said. I like the way you framed it. So I want to ask you to imagine that there's a lot of data and information that has the potential to inform how well we understand complicated and rare and important human diseases, that has the possibility of improving diagnosis and stratification, but simply because we haven't organized ourselves effectively, that potential is not going to be met because the data is all in silos, it's all in non-interoperable formats, the methods don't have any standardization. That's the world that, together with many colleagues, we're trying to avoid having happen. It's actually already happened with electronic medical records, but that's not our topic here today, and there's the Obama administration and the Bush administration before it have done a lot to actually try and change that. But trying to get ahead on that problem, I'm here representing a group of people who have come together, right now 70 organizations with individuals working in 40 countries so far, who have signed on to create together a new global alliance to enable the responsible sharing of genomic and clinical data. So the prompting of this is that there's really a new era in the ability to collect data on people's genome sequences. The cost of sequencing a genome has fallen 1 million-fold in the last 10 years. And whereas a few years ago there were only a handful of human genomes that had ever been sequenced, today's there are tens of thousands, and it's widely anticipated that soon there'll be millions. And individuals are choosing to have their genomes characterized for research purposes, for clinical use, and just for personal use. So this, we do believe, has a tremendous opportunity in terms of cancer, inherited disease, infectious disease, drug response, and it's already being used in the diagnosis and treatment of cancer and rare genetic diseases. But the challenge is we don't know how to read a genome sequence. So we can write it down, that's what those machines do, but we don't know how to interpret it. The only way today, and probably for the foreseeable future, that we're going to be able to interpret a genome is to compare it to many others and say, well, people who had changes like you have seem to have a higher rate of this disease or responded to that cancer drug. It also turns out you need sample sizes of millions of individuals to do this, because each disease is complex. There are many different genes and many different variants, and there are a lot of different diseases. So you need large sample sets. You would also like the methods to be interoperable. So if somebody invents an analytical method and it works on data set X, then it would be possible to use it on data set Y. But our community is not actually organized yet to make those things possible. The other thing that's very important is that when you're dealing with personal data, people's health information and their genome sequences, issues of ethics and privacy are paramount. These have been in a lot of attention in recent days. And our group came together actually and came to the position that, first of all, we have to respect more than almost anything else an individual's autonomy to decide what to do with their data, their personal health data. That's what we could mean by privacy, that you can decide. You might choose to share it broadly, you might choose to share it narrowly, or you might choose to share it not at all. And whatever standards and methods we have to honor and respect that. Right now, informed consent is done one institution and one study at a time, and John Wilbanks is here and others have advocated an approach in which you could actually have your dynamic contact the individual with the uses of their data. So in January, a group of us came together, and actually I just want to mention a number of people who are in the room here who are at our meeting. Peter Goodhand, Brad Margus, David Hausler, who organized the meeting together with me and a number of other people, but also John and Steve Friend and David Lippman, Tom Friedman, Sharon Terry, Mark Daly. If I missed anyone else who was involved in this activity, I apologize. And we together wrote a white paper that described what we thought was needed, and we came to the conclusion that the single greatest need was an organization in some way modeled on the World Wide Web Consortium, which was be a non-governmental, not-for-profit, international public-private body that would advocate standards, both technical standards, so you wouldn't be in the position where you couldn't exchange information and run algorithms, but also harmonization of ethics and privacy, and couple those two so that the methods that were developed would support rather than get in the way of the menu of options that we need to have. So far, as I said, 70 organizations have signed on. We're here to invite others who want to join us. And our view is, and I'll close with this, that there are many groups around the world working on this. We want to be very clear. We didn't invent this problem or find it for the first time. But our belief is that by working together in this way, we will more effectively deal with difficult issues and accelerate progress than if we each work on it alone.
Eric Kansa.
Hi, everybody. So I'm an archaeologist, and it's one of those kinds of areas of research that people say, oh, I would have loved to have majored in archaeology. And it's also one of those things that parents also say about their kids, ooh, I really hope they don't major in archaeology. And it's, for part of that is that we as an archaeologists have, it's a fascinating area. It's inherently really interesting because it's about us, right? We're looking at material remains of the human past. It's about the evolution and change of our cultures, our societies. Where did we come from? All of these really interesting questions about our origins. And the reason why I got into this open science and open access and open data movement is that it's a really privileged kind of a position to be an archaeologist. We're working on behalf of the public that funds us, and we have a lot of responsibilities. As archaeologists, when we dig up sites, we destroy them. And the records that we create, the databases that we create, all those pictures that we take, that is the record that is going to be passed on to future generations that's going to be available to everybody else, and that's a huge responsibility. So if we don't really act as good stewards of this, then we're falling down on our job, and we're basically mining archaeological sites for pretty things, for tenure, to write a couple little articles and papers and books and that kind of thing. And that's what really got us interested in this idea of data sharing. And when we've been doing this now for 10 years, and it's so gratifying to see that this is now so much more, so much easier than it used to be 10 years ago. I mean, we're at the White House, which is pretty cool, talking about open data, and this is a neat conversation to have. And some of the things that we've been working on in this area to try to advance this is that data isn't just filling up terabytes worth of stuff in big repositories. It's actually a new form, new way that researchers can communicate with themselves, but also communicate to the larger public. So when we publish the archaeological data sets that we're publishing them in really a new kind of a genre of scholarly communications, new way of researchers can share with one another in the larger public. And that creates all sorts of interesting new challenges too. Like we have to talk about what do we mean by data quality? How do we promote data quality and ensure the reliability of the data? And how do we do that in a way that we can communicate not only amongst archaeologists, but to people in other disciplines? So one of the really exciting things I think that's happening with open data and open science is that it's really opening doors for us in archaeology. And in archaeology, we're not necessarily known for huge amounts of funding and everything like that. But we can, because of the openness of what's going on with our colleagues in the biological sciences and the physical sciences and all sorts of areas, we can tap into their contributions and we can contribute something in return. So one of the really neat things about that is just that this inherent multidisciplinary kind of role that openness is really it can really facilitate. So just one quick example of this. We're mainly funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Office of Digital Humanities, and they're funding us to work on these questions about promoting data quality, doing peer review, editorial review around researcher data sets. And piggybacked along this, we got some funding from the Encyclopedia of Life, which is building a giant database of all the world's biological taxa, every species, every kind of biological classification you can imagine. And we're publishing interesting data about bones that describe the domestication process of animals in the Middle East. And those bones, we're integrating them together so they could be seen en masse, and we're relating them to these larger standards that other people in the bioinformatics community are developing. So the Encyclopedia of Life is one. Another group is Uberon, which is describing how your anatomy, different parts of your anatomy relate to developmental processes like embryology and developmental biology, and that links up to genetics. And by us using these standards that are being developed by our colleagues widely, we're able to relate archaeology, which is something that you sort of think about with artifacts in Indiana Jones and that kind of stuff, link that all up with work that's going on with our colleagues in the biological sciences. And what's neat about that is that we've got some really interesting contributions there that we can bring on into this larger world that other folks here might be really interested in too. So it's really interesting to be part of all this, and it's a huge pleasure and a huge privilege to do so. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Steve Friend.
The theme for what I want to talk about probably can be captured by much of what you just heard, which is if physicists and mathematicians can do it, if archaeologists can do it, why can't biomedical researchers do it? And what I mean by that is rapid learning and engagement of big data. Medicine has been a combination of scholarly, priestly guilds of experts who sort of off on their own, primarily driven by hypothesis-driven research, have moved us forward greatly. But four things have happened in the last decade. One, David talked about, which is the power of omics to break open what we thought were homogeneous diseases and made us realize that arthritis or depression actually is rather individualized. And the fact that now you can store data in large places, so if you actually were able to collect it, you can put it there. It also has been, the world has been changed by the fact that individuals realize that they can come together without a PhD. You'll hear a little bit from Jack after the break, but you don't have to have a degree if you have passion and experience. And the concept that patients are primarily voyeurs is sort of an odd thing when you're trying to work on disease. And put that together then with also the fact that beautiful efforts have gone on in recognizing that crowds working as groups almost always beat the individual lone wolf. And you put those four things together, the omics, what went on in terms of storing data, the power of having citizens actually involved in their own diseases, and you put that together with the fact that actually groups who are non-experts can really be experts. And you see that there's a serious discontinuity between the state of our institutions and the state of our technologies. So 4 years ago, after having spent a fair amount of time in academia, biotech, and industry, something happened to me one day walking down a corridor in a building where I realized I can't talk to any scientist and expect them to tell me what they're doing for more than 10 minutes before they'll say, I really can't tell you this, but. Something is wrong with the way we've built the system in terms of incentives and rewards and having people eager to share the data the way Paul talked about on arXiv. Okay? And Sage BioNetworks, started 4 years ago as a nonprofit foundation, just 40 of us, has really been trying to look at why not? Why can't you make that work? What types of incentives and rewards are we going to need to have for scientists, for patients, for citizens that would allow them to work that way? We spent some time being totally wrong, that actually if you just put closed data out there in the public domain, people would use it. We found that actually was sort of naive. Opening up data by itself does not actually usually pull people into wanting to work on it. We then realized that actually first, last name authorships are the currency that people get rewarded, whether it's their tenure, whether it is promotion, whether it is other things. And that until we had a way where someone could talk about something and not feel as if they just hurt themselves, until there was a way where actually people got credit for what they were doing as they were doing it, how could you expect to accelerate research, no matter what research you were doing? And so we built a technology platform, Mike Kellen and Technology Platform Group did, called Synapse. And its concept, very much like GitHub, was to make it so that anyone who had an idea, who wanted to do something different in the data, were all transparent and able to be captured for someone else. So David Hausler, we've been working with recently, a way for all the TCGA genetic data could have teams working with each other on that data in real time, not waiting till I'm now ready to publish it. But the thing that broke open the sense that actually, at heart, scientists really are ready to share if you could let them get there, was the fact that we started working with Gustavo Stolbitsky at IBM and the Dream Challenge team that they had there, and recognized that if you put large amounts of of data out so that the public could get to it, you could run challenges like we did last year on breast cancer, where we took 2,000 women's records, clinical genetic, in the cloud, where it was able to be, people could work on that data, and then watched 30 countries, hundreds of teams, thousands of models playing off of each other, because here's the lesson. If you want people to share, let them compete. Let them see that someone else is getting there, and they look at that leaderboard and they go, my God, maybe I could. And so we have to think hard about incentives and rewards. If we're going to open up data, we're going to provide insights, we need to have tools that actually change those incentives and rewards, shift the way our current institutions function.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the champions for describing the work that you do. You mentioned something just now, Stephen, on currency of science, and how do we actually create a new currency of science using open data and credit for data? What is missing from this formula? How do we get there?
I think several on the panel can also answer
I think
this.
David could probably speak to this as well.
And so I'll just make a start, but David, you can probably pick. It's actually not too hard in a general sense, and then hard in the particular. But in a general sense, it's that people actually have to know that someone is going to recognize them for what they're doing. There is no reason why first-last authorship has to have that primary status, that there are things called H-impact scores that people have. I was talking to someone working at the NIH who's interested in doing an S-index, which is about sharing. And so we just have to change the incentive structures, is what I'm really in a broad sense. And then, David, maybe you want to talk about the things you've looked at to change those incentives, those rewards.
Well, I don't know that we have the power to change the incentives, and I think it's actually useful to think about the differences in, for example, physics and biomedical research. What are the incentive differences whereby 20 years ago, even actually before the physics archive that Paul was involved in starting up, physicists broadly shared their preprints. They didn't just give a paper to a colleague to get feedback, just one or two, but they actually wanted to give it to quite a few people, and that's why Paul's approach was so great, because they could put it in the archive and give it to everybody. Whereas in biomedical research, this has been true for quite a long time, scientists really didn't give their papers to everybody, and they still don't feel that way. I think that GenBank has been successful for one thing because there were rules that NIH said if you're going to publish a paper with NIH funded with funds, we want that sequence to be in GenBank. Now, once you created that, scientists found that they could make discoveries with other people's data, and so many scientists, without this being a rule, were doing it. But I do think that I don't have the answer. I think the answer must be found, though, in studying the differences that existed 20 years ago in physics and in biomedicine, and probably still exist.
I think.
Go ahead.
No, I think one other thing that will happen naturally and is already happening with Stephen's comment about patients and other members of society actively participating is it keeps our eye on the ball, at least in medical science, that our goal is actually make progress in the disease rather than to publish papers. And I think that one of the things that's actually been very gratifying in our field, and Mark Daly's here today, recognized for his work in the Psychiatric Genetics Consortium and also in autoimmune diseases, where the whole field has actually come together, put their data together, and tried together to solve problems that are beyond any individual group, and actually is succeeding. And I think that the focus on are we making progress in schizophrenia as opposed to are we individually publishing papers, actually itself, without any change in our institutions and our rules, does a wonderful job. I think it's just sometimes we're not asking the right question if we say, are we only going to reward brilliant ideas and individual publications, or are we also going to reward or recognize making progress in diseases?
People today will note, just moving on to another subject, people today will note that we are lousy with biologists today across the entire spectrum. And that's because we've had a lot of success in sharing data and publications in the biological sciences. One second. So one of the things that I'd like to talk to you, in particular, Paul and Eric, and perhaps some advice from you guys, if there are other fields where we're not seeing this kind of sharing of information in open science, how do we actually start to create the cultural changes that are necessary to start driving that kind of change there as well?
So the comment I was going to make is when I give talks on this subject, I have a slide that I project which says 2007 government requires internet users to post videos to YouTube. And of course, and that's why YouTube took off. And so the point I am trying to make about that is that the system that I set up, and as David correctly said, there was a prehistory to that which facilitated it. But the methodology has always been to create a set of resources that are so overwhelmingly useful that people just spontaneously participate in it because it's a form of social networking. And scientific authors are writing in order to be read. And this sort of public information is a public utility in the sense that it becomes more valuable through reuse. And
So how do we create the cultural change?
So back in the early to mid-1990s, people looked at our usage data and said, aha, look, the computer scientists aren't participating. Astrophysicists said, well, that's very good for you high-energy physicists who are only interested in the things that were produced within the last 10 nanoseconds, but serious scientists like condensed matter physicists will never turn on. And so my point is that it just is a matter of time, and there's a ratchet effect once a community signs on. And part of it is what Stephen mentioned, I believe, seeing the cutting-edge stuff in there and realizing this is the way to stake the intellectual priority claim, and also to have it ingested, have the data pulled into the big indices, make it more findable, will start catalyzing more usage. I think, the other point that I made, which was not made in jest, is a lot of it is just going to happen because of the next generation of people that's just grown up with this idea of sharing perhaps too much.
Yeah. So one of the things that... It's true. Some of us do. You guys on Twitter can actually grab that one. So a couple of people have now mentioned some of the limitations around intellectual property and legal frameworks. Drew, you earlier said that you had some interest, something that you wanted to announce today on legal frameworks.
Yeah, I think a good comment around all of this is not just talking about open science and technology, but trying experiments and doing stuff and finding out what works. In the world of biotechnology, a number of years ago, through Mark Fisher and David Graywall, we set out to try an experiment around property rights for biotech and drafted something called the BioBrick Public Agreement, which is a free-to-use legal tool for freely sharing free-to-use genetic stuff. And it's online now at biobricks.org. And what you see in that framework is contributions coming in, and completely agreeing with the points just made, contributions now importantly that represent the best available genetically encoded words, the best genetic logic gates, the best parts for controlling gene expression are all free to use now through the BioBrick Public Agreement. And we've had to prime that pump by doing the work. But what's very, very exciting is yesterday we had a company called DNA 2.0 make a contribution, and Klaus Gustafsson here from Menlo Park, and they gave away some fluorescent proteins, which sounds kind of strange. Like, what's a fluorescent protein? Well, it's just a protein that glows. And these are free fluorescent proteins. They're some of the most important tools in biotechnology because they let you see what the cells are doing. They're so important that in the United States, it's estimated that there's about 1,400 patents filed on uses of green fluorescent and other proteins. So it's incredible to have a community begin, including industry. I think when you talk about open science and open technology, by the way, academics are some of the worst people to make it happen all the time. You need to complement that with all sectors of society, including business, and enabling people to make money. But so in any case, I want to really celebrate the fact that we now have a tool available for everybody to use. If you'd like to build a free-to-use language for programming life, all successful languages, in my opinion, end up being free, like English, like most of the software languages now in use. You can now do that through the BioBrick Public Agreement. Thank you.
Wow, that's fantastic. So Eric, you as well wanted to talk about, I think a lot of people have made the point that training in and around the use of open data is essential for getting cultural shifts.
Right. I think that's one of the things that also has to be noted because when we're talking about opening science or opening data, we also have to recognize that the whole professional landscape is changing in academia. So something like 70% of undergraduate courses are now taught by adjunct professors who are short-term contract people who are teaching and then released, and then when they're not with the university affiliation, they usually lose all of their access to literature, and this is a huge issue, and this is also an issue where there's this whole new realm of professional development and careers that are, sometimes loosely called alt-acs, alternative academics, where people are sort of working more in these sort of information-intensive ways with traditional disciplines. So a lot of the informatic-y kinds of jobs that are now around are not necessarily in traditional academic departments. And this kind of constituency, those changing patterns and careers are also changing the incentive structures in science. And I think that the opening that we're seeing, part of the opening that we're seeing in science and in data is related to that because you have more people engaged with working with data, working with computers, engaged in open source projects, open data, open source. A lot of these things are just, when you're engaged in it, you really understand the efficiencies that you get out of that. And you also really start to understand and appreciate the role and the reputation you build within your community as you contribute more and as you share more. And this is, I think, part of the dynamic that I think is going to be opening up the sciences is that the career patterns are changing, and so the sort of traditional pattern of publish or perish is not necessarily always the case now for everybody doing interesting science.
Great. Stephen, please.
Thanks. Last week, we announced the this year's challenges, Dream 8 challenges involving.
Can you explain a little bit about what that is?
So these are projects where we pose a question to anyone who wants to answer it. They don't have to have a PhD. They can get together with anyone. So what I mean by a challenge is taking data and saying the winner will be found within this challenge by who can do the best job at this or that. And last week, 3 of the challenges were initiated with the help of Gustavo. But today I wanted to unveil 2 that I think thread these through to an impact on patients in ways that I think show where one can go. First is in Alzheimer's disease. This is co-led with the CEO Initiative in Alzheimer's, George Vredenberg's effort. And we have been able, with the help of ADNI, the Alzheimer's Association, to identify large data sets, clinical, imaging, cognitive scores, but now sequencing. And Robert Green is here in the audience. He and Peter St. George Hislop have formed an SAB. And what we're going to do is see if the biomarkers or classifiers that ordinarily might be done by a single group could be done by a community. And so this effort is going to kick off in the fall. Similarly, in arthritis, you may know that about only a third of the people who take the drugs that are most commonly given in arthritis, these approved drugs, get a real benefit out of it. And so we've thought, wouldn't it be interesting if you could get academia and industry together to pool all the data that's available in genomic information, clinical information, and put that together, put that out in the public domain, and ask whether that was possible to build better classifiers. So Beth and patients from the Arthritis Foundation are here today. Peter Gregerson, who has been a key with Robert Plenge in putting together this data, are doing this. And there are 2 points I want to make quickly. One is, you might ask, so what does the winner get? Well, they get 2 things. One is, thanks to Nature Genetics, the winner of that challenge,
The journal Nature Genetics.
the journal Nature Genetics, will have an opportunity to be the lead author on a paper because of how they did. This is called challenge-assisted peer review. But the other, which I think is most important, and it's with help from linking with the FDA, is our plan is to have the most important thing, which is whoever is able to build that classifier will have that classifier used in a clinical trial directly. So the real reward is that the work that you did comes back, and citizens on the Internet Registry can say, hey, I want to partake in this. And so I think it's trying to close a loop between geeks, between patients, between those who really have not been brought into the system, and try to make the incentive turn into a circle.
That is fantastic. So there are a number of champions today that are going to be making announcements, and what we'll do is we'll post something on the OSTP blog later on today or tomorrow morning, detailing all of these. I want to thank all of you for today. In closing, I want to give you guys an opportunity to talk about what are the next steps for open science. What is the missing piece here that we're just not doing yet?
I'll make one comment. Others may want to jump in, but
Please.
I want to put in a sort of a challenge. I'll do one sort of like Stephen's challenges, but to scientists, young and old, faculty, academia, to think about the impact of mentorship and role modeling. And what I mean by that is that what I've been astounded by is that when people sort of act in the way we're describing or reward people based on sharing, this event in some way is trying to do that, people respond. You don't have to, again, tell them how to do it. You have to give them maybe some opportunity to do it. But I think that we shouldn't look only to our institutions. We should also look at just sort of, day-to-day in science, the professors and the classes and the thesis committee meetings. Are we acting in this way or not? Because I think if we send a complicated message where we say it's really good to share, but then the individual students and trainees and others are told, or young faculty are told, but you're not going to get rewarded for that, it's not going to happen. And so I think that's just my hope for how we take this to the next level, is to sort of act like what we're saying we should do.
So this is part of the cultural shift that we've been talking about. How do we start to nucleate that cultural shift?
I think it's amazing to recognize how young the internet still is and how little experience we have with separating information and location and recombining. I think about how most of the scientists aren't professionally scientists and what that looks like to go way, way forward. Apparently, the best designer of RNA folding is a mostly anonymous librarian in Denmark who gets access to a computer server in California that allows her to do the experiments anonymously. Who would have thought? So what happens when we create platform resources, combine that, for example, to games? Many people play World of Warcraft. What would it be like to have a war in favor of open science somehow? But connect that to experimentation and whatnot. So I think if we could recognize that separation of experiments, information, and people recombining through the network as it continues to evolve, all of a sudden you're not just talking about academics, you're talking about citizens, greatly expanding what it means to develop science and technology. I'd like to see that pursued as part of the frontier.
David, you've led on data sharing and on publications. In terms of how we evolve to the next step in providing increased access to scientific publications, what does the future look like moving forward to provide a sustainable system for publishers who provide value for the scientific community, but at the same time increase access to scientific publications for the public to really drive progress?
Boy, there's a lot in your question there.
I'm basically giving you free rein here.
Good. Well, I want to talk about some songs I've been.
It's dangerous
No.
with him. You'll understand. You'll understand.
No, seriously though. So part of this is like, well, what is the next step? I think in biomedical research, we are seeing more data sharing for a variety of reasons that the folks here have talked about. And we're also beginning to see more and more of the scientists publish in open access journals. Now, people have this notion that open access journal, it's free. It's free for the user. It's not free for the authors. The authors have to pay fees, but actually biomedical researchers have paid fees for society journals to publish their content, for figures, color figures, and so forth in the past. And one of the advantages of the scientist who's publishing having to pay the fee directly is then you get the sort of cycle that allows the market to work so that it's a service, and so I can choose, well, I'm willing to pay more because they're providing me some better service, or they're providing me a different service, and so forth. And we're seeing that right now. PLOS ONE is growing incredibly quickly. I think there are going to be on the order of maybe 30,000 articles in a year, and there's others that are growing quickly, not just because they're open access. Open access does say that I know everybody can read my paper, but they're providing some kind of special service to the authors. It still costs to publish there, but I think that those pressures that are on the providers will make them more efficient, make them more inventive, just like the market works in a lot of other ways, but the cost will go down. I think one other thing that's really critical, though, if we see that the data sharing is going to increase and more of the literature is going to be more open, I think we really need to see new channels for scientists to communicate about the science, that we need that. The web provides a lot of ways that people can do that in many other areas, but an area where the community should be communicating as much as any other, the biomedical research or the scientists in general, they're not really taking advantage of some of these opportunities to communicate about papers that they're reading, about new data sets that are available, to stimulate new kinds of collaboration. And I think that that new form, there will be a new channel, I'm sure of it. That new channel will be somewhere in between, you know, the Facebook, Twitter type of totally open thing and the kind of formal publication means that are available now. And I think it'll be one of those things that'll just start happening, and all of a sudden we'll turn around and realize, wow, it's too bad this didn't happen 20 years ago. So I think that's where I see this going.
Fantastic. Let's hear it for our first set of champions today. Thank you all. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. You guys. Thank you all again. We have a surprise guest here, at least for some of you. Others have already heard that Todd Park, the Chief Technology Officer for the country, is here. He will be coming out now to address everyone on some of the efforts the administration has made on open science. With that, Todd Park.
Hello!
How's everybody doing? Having a good time? Excellent. My name is Todd Park, and I serve as U.S. Chief Technology Officer and Assistant to the President. And in addition to everyone else who's been saying this, and everyone across the White House, I want to personally congratulate the champions of change here today that we honor as champions of open science. You are truly at the forefront of an amazing open data and knowledge revolution. You're making scientific research open and available to the public for free, and your leadership in all of this work not only impacts research, but generates deep and fundamental benefits for society as a whole. We know that opening data pays off. We're huge fans of opening up data and knowledge. So as one example, when the government decided years ago to make weather data from satellites and ground stations freely available to the public in electronic form, it gave rise to an entire economic sector that today powers newscasts and weather apps and commercial advisory services for agriculture and new insurance offices and much more. Similarly, when Presidents Reagan and Clinton opened up access to the global positioning system, which had originally been built for the military, but allowed civilian and commercial folks to actually use it, this gave rise to GPS-powered innovations of all kinds, navigation systems, location-based apps, precision farming, so on and so forth, which have collectively added tens of billions of dollars annually to the American economy and improved all of our lives in all kinds of remarkable ways. Innovations in technology to generate, store, share, and process data in biomedical research have ushered in an era of incredible opportunity. As I think a lot of you know, as one example, the rapid and open sharing of genomic data from the Human Genome Project revolutionized biomedical research and spurred major growth in the biotech industry. One study actually put the return on investment to the economy at 178 to 1, an amazing return on investment, all powered and fundamentally founded upon open scientific data. The two challenges that Stephen Friend is announcing today are great additional examples of how open science can power innovation. Tackling complex diseases, tapping into the power of everyone to accelerate our ability to understand and eventually treat rheumatoid arthritis and Alzheimer's. This is hugely inspiring and should be massively applauded and celebrated. So we are deeply committed, all of us, the President on down, to continuing to open up data and knowledge to spur innovation, entrepreneurship, and scientific discovery. As part of our digital government strategy and open data initiatives, teams across the government have been hard at work on open data initiatives in health, energy, education, public safety, global development, and finance, unlocking valuable data from the vaults of the government, releasing it in machine-readable form, and making it available as fuel for the public, for innovators, entrepreneurs, researchers, to create general awesomeness. It's really been an incredible thing to see. On February 22nd of this year, as I think Dr. Holdren mentioned earlier, and as I think probably everyone in this room knows, was part of the movement that actually engendered this, we took the first step in dramatically increasing public access to the results of federally funded research when Dr. Holdren issued the now famous memorandum to the heads of federal agencies, directing them to develop plans to make peer-reviewed publications describing research results available to the public within 1 year of initial publication, just a massive step forward. And there's data jujitsu, which I'm sure you noticed, actually, in that particular memo, because it also requires that agencies develop plans to improve the management and sharing of the digital data produced in the course of that federally funded scientific research. So that's actually a fabulous, fabulous step as well. That memo was actually soon followed by a landmark executive order that President Obama issued on May 9th. This order is entitled Making Open and Machine-Readable the New Default for Government Information. Really, really big deal. It takes historic steps to make government-held data more accessible to the public as fuel for innovation, discovery, and economic growth. Under the terms of that executive order and an accompanying open data policy released by the Office of Management and Budget and the Office of Science and Tech Policy, all newly generated government data and information resources going forward will, by default, be made available in open, machine-readable formats, greatly enhancing their accessibility and usefulness, while continuing to apply safeguards, of course, that rigorously protect privacy and national security. Making this kind of data and information accessible, discoverable, usable by the public can help to fuel ever-growing waves of awesomeness, entrepreneurship, innovation, and economic growth, all of which improve Americans' lives. And just as one recent example, I don't know if you heard about this, but the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services just recently released a data set, a huge data set, that for the first time shows what hospitals across the country charge for inpatient services associated with the top 100 kinds of hospital stays. The data have revealed massive variations in hospital charges across the country, even within metropolitan areas. Like in Birmingham, Alabama, as one example, the average hospital charge for a hip and knee replacement varies from $23,000 at one hospital to $141,000 at another. This kind of data is real fuel for change, and demand for it is very, very real as well. So within 24 hours of us actually posting this data set for electronic download by the public, the full database was downloaded over 100,000 times. Entrepreneurs are actually taking that data and using them to build and power consumer-friendly apps that can help people across the country get the information they need to make the healthcare decisions that are best for them. Researchers, analysts, and journalists are combing through the data, trying to figure out what's going on with this variation and bring you insight as to why it might be happening. The marketplace is becoming more transparent, will become more competitive, and through these and other data, like hospital quality metrics, the healthcare marketplace will become more transparent, competitive, and deliver better results that will benefit everybody. So open data, punchline, is really, really good for the American people. And the commitment to open data, open knowledge, and open science that these champions, the champions here today, have shown is extraordinary. But we've got to do more. We've got to go further. We've taken the first steps toward open as the default for scientific research results. And with your help and leadership, we'll keep plowing ahead and keep taking things to ever higher levels of excellence and general awesomeness. So I can't wait to hear more of the exciting stories and announcements from today's champions. I just wanted to thank you so much from the bottom of our heart for your commitment and all of your work and dedication. And actually thank you even more for what you will do going forward. Because there's a lot of work still to do, a lot of incredible benefit to be unlocked for the American public, and y'all will lead the way. Thanks so much. God bless you. May the force be with you in open science. And I look forward to checking in the future with you on everything that you'll continue to do. Thanks so much.
Isn't he great? He's like that all the time, too. It's amazing. I can imagine waking up in the morning. Good morning. So, with that, I'd like to welcome up the next set of champions. I'll introduce them as they're walking up here. Jack Andraka, he's an inventor and high school student. Kathy Giusti is with the Multiple Myeloma Foundation. John Quackenbush with Genospace, who's also a professor at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Jerry Ostreicher with Columbia University in Princeton. Atul Butte with Stanford University. Rebecca Moore with Google. And Will Knoll with University of Pennsylvania. This is our second set of champions. Please welcome them. You can sit right here if you like. There we go. Jack, I'm gonna share it with you if that's all right.
Sounds like a deal.
You sure?
Yep.
All right, cool. So you'll notice that one of these things is not like the other. Jack Andraka is an inventor who took advantage of open science. I'd like, Jack, please explain to the folks here. It's remarkable. Please tell them what you have done.
So essentially what I did, I was in 9th grade. I created a new way to detect pancreatic, ovarian, and lung cancer that costs 3 cents and takes 5 minutes to run. It's 168 times faster, over 26,000 times less expensive, and over 400 times more sensitive than current methods of diagnosis. And currently, it has close to 100% accuracy and can detect the cancer in the earliest stage when someone has close to 100% chance of survival. And it could be broadly extended to really any disease, ranging from Alzheimer's to other forms of cancer, even HIV, AIDS, and heart disease. And so I remember I did my first science fair when I was 11 years old. I had this bowl cut and these glasses. And that was really the first time that I ran into open science, because I ran into these paywalls. And I was just like, it asked me for $35. This was the first time ever. And I'm just like.
How old were you at this time?
I was 11.
Okay.
And I was just like, why would anyone pay $35 for 11 sheets of paper? And then I figured out that would be me, because I couldn't find it anywhere else. And so then it asked me for my login info, so I type in my email login, and it says it's invalid. And so then my 7th grade or 6th grade self took immediate offense and thought to the computer, you're invalid. And eventually I begged my mom and my dad to finally pay for that article, and then it turned out it had nothing to do with the research that I needed. And the unfortunate thing is that these articles don't have return policies. I can't just be like, okay, please have my money back. No. Apparently they're just like, nope. So that's really why, and as I progressed through science fairs, a lot of the things that my friends told me is that, well, if those darn paywalls went away, then we could do so much more. And now I'm really beginning to see that because, for example, Harvard University released a statement just a few years ago, or just last year actually, that stated that due to the increases in prices of these major subscriptions, they couldn't afford to continue paying for them. And think, that's Harvard University. They have like $3 million for that. 15-year-olds don't really have that in their budget. That's not in my allowance. And so that's why I've become a huge advocate, and that's why I'm talking about it everywhere. I was just actually in Toronto talking about it, so fun, fun, fun.
Thank you, Jack. I think I share everyone's enthusiasm for how ridiculous you are. We love you. Rebecca Moore from Google, please tell us about time-lapse.
All right. So I work on the Google Earth and Maps team, and many people are familiar with those tools. More than 1 billion people have downloaded Google Earth. More than 1 billion people use Google Maps every week. Some of you may have even used Google Maps to get here today, and you didn't get lost, so that's good. So, are we done? No. In fact, in 2008, I was in the Brazilian Amazon, and I was approached by a Brazilian geoscientist, that is someone who works on analyzing satellite data and map data, and he explained there's a terrible problem in the Amazon. They were losing at that time more than 1 million acres a year to deforestation, most of it illegal, happening in remote parts of the rainforest where there was not good law enforcement on the ground. And he said it's actually possible by analyzing satellite data automatically, using daily feeds of satellite data, to create an automated alerting system. However, it's terabytes of data. And just managing that data on a single computer is difficult, getting access to it. And then trying to do the analysis on that data actually takes weeks or months. So by the time you've got your result, it's too late. And he said, Google, you have all this data. You let us look at it in Google Earth and Maps. Why don't you let us do science on it? Let us do analysis on it and give us access to your computers. So we came to understand that there's a really interesting situation that the satellite data, through very enlightened open data policy of the US government, NASA and USGS, has made the data public and free. But as a practical matter, it's not that accessible. It comes off the satellite and it goes onto tapes in a vault in South Dakota. So I brought that challenge back to Google and got permission to basically build a new technology for science, for environmental analysis that we called Google Earth Engine. Earth Engine because it's an analytical engine for the planet. And our dream is to bring in every day all of the most important, relevant satellite data and other environmental data, atmospheric data, and make that available for science and for informing public policy. So we did that. We now have more than 1 petabyte of satellite data, and it's coming in every day from various satellites. And we decided to try it ourselves. And so the time-lapse project that Michael mentioned, we just launched last month an animated, zoomable, 30-year interactive map of the Earth. And what that means is you can fly back. So Google Earth and Maps, you can fly around, right? You can zoom around. But it's a static image of the planet. Imagine we've added the fourth dimension, time. So while you're flying around, the Earth is animating from 1984 to 2012, right? And you can see unbelievable phenomena that have never been really easily accessible before. So you see Las Vegas growing while Lake Mead nearby is shrinking. You see the deforestation of the Amazon. You see Columbia Glacier receding. You see the creation of the artificial islands off Dubai. It's amazing the phenomena that are accessible in seconds. So we launched that last month, and within less than a week, we had more than 3 million visitors to the site. And blogs and newspapers were embedding time lapses of their locality all over the place because it was so fascinating. So that's great. But then what I think we're even more excited about is we've put Earth Engine in the hands of the scientific community. We now have more than 1,000 scientists who are using it for everything from deforestation analysis to estimating crop yield, predicting drought. For example, scientist Matt Hansen, working with the government of Mexico, used Earth Engine to create the most detailed map of Mexico's forests and water ever created. It involved analyzing 53,000 Landsat images. It was 15,000 hours of computation. But because we ran it on 1,000 computers in parallel, the result was available in less than a day. It would have taken almost 3 years on a single computer. Now we're working with him to scale that up globally. It's taking millions of hours of computation, and I tease him that he's dimming the lights of Google, right? Another scientist, and this really speaks to the benefit of open science, not just open data. Alessandro Bacchini and his colleagues at Woods Hole have created a pan-tropical biomass map. Okay, this is estimating the density of forest canopy all over the world, and they're using that to estimate carbon. Okay, that's great. But now they've put that data in Earth Engine, and other scientists are using that as the input to their analysis. For example, Save the Elephants and Jane Goodall Institute are mashing that biomass data up with tracking data for elephants, chimp nest site data to estimate where chimps may nest in the future or which habitats need to be protected. So it's informing policy. The last example I'll just mention, I'm very pleased that we've now just hit the 1-year anniversary of our first Brazilian scientist has now been operationally monitoring the Brazilian Amazon for a year using Google Earth Engine, and he's told us that it is literally saving hectares of forest every month because they're getting those timely alerts out to law enforcement. So I'm very happy about that. I guess I'll just close by saying that it's an honor for us at Google to be able to use our massive data hosting and compute capability in service of these humanitarian and environmentally beneficial causes. Thank you.
Rebecca, what's the URL?
Did I pay you to say that? So the platform is earthengine.google.org. That'll get you to the main page, and if you want to see the time lapse, it's just earthengine.google.org/timelapse. Check it out.
Can you search for that on Google?
You can search.
So the next two champions are the dynamic duo that we have today. Kathy Giusti and John Quackenbush have teamed up to tackle multiple myeloma, an absolutely devastating disease. Please tell us about the project that you guys launched.
Sure. Thank you very much. My name's Kathy, and I am a myeloma patient. And for those of you who don't know what multiple myeloma is, it's a blood cancer, and it is considered uniformly fatal today. When I was diagnosed with the disease, I was given 3 years to live. So I hope that today I can be the person that is representing all cancer patients in the room, because even listening to the first panel and all the amazing science going on and the commitment that all of these people have to putting data in the public domain, it gives tremendous hope. And I can promise you that representing as many cancer patients as I do, the one thing that we really, really care about is finding a cure in our lifetime. It's the reason that we get out of bed in the morning living with a fatal disease. It's the reason we put our feet on the ground and go out for another day. And we care deeply, deeply about urgency. And when I was diagnosed, there was not a drug for myeloma in the pipeline. There really wasn't any reason to hope, but I have learned the hard way by working with amazing partners, scientists like we see in the room today, pharma companies, people like John, that we can make unbelievable progress by taking a stand and developing new models. So just to give you a little bit of sense of what we've done in the world of myeloma, when we started the foundation, the MMRF, what we did was we knew we had to build collaborative models, because in these uncommon diseases, you have to build critical mass. If there's not everybody working on it and you have all these silos, you'll never get to any answers. So we started by building our own clinical network, which is now 16 centers strong. That clinical network has fielded over 50 phase 1 and 2 clinical trials of 25 drugs. And then we started building our own collaborative tissue bank where everybody banks tissue together, and we have over 4,000 tissue samples for our scientists to use. And then we said, okay, let's develop a genomic initiative with the Broad Institute and TGen, and indeed we were the first to sequence the myeloma genome. So I can look 10 years later and say, thanks to some unbelievable partners, we've done amazing work. Multiple myeloma has seen 6 drugs approved by FDA since we started. And for many of you know, it's 10 years to get a new drug to market. And we have more than doubled the lifespan of our patients. But I don't wake up in the morning and look at my children and say, it's okay, because now I'll live 6 years instead of 3. I look at them and say, you know what, there's so much opportunity. And you heard about it on the first panel, everything going on with genomic sequencing and how we'll put data in the public domain. So our company has given another commitment to the next model that we're working on, and that model is to provide the highest quality genomic and clinical longitudinal data that we can possibly provide. And we're doing that through our COMPASS study. The reason that you end up in such a dilemma in cancer research is we've done a good job with 6 drugs. We can actually get a great response rate for our patients when we first put them on a combination drug for myeloma, but we relapse. We relapse over and over and over again, and that's why we die. We have not figured out why the cancer cells get so smart and go around us. So until you have beautiful genomic and clinical data, and you're following patients longitudinally, collecting that bone marrow at relapse, you'll never be able to figure out the secrets to curing cancer. You just won't. And data is a really wonderful, wonderful thing. So the fact that we're following 1,000 patients right now and pulling that data together is great. But if you're not putting it out in the public domain where every researcher can use it, that's crazy. It's crazy if we're not doing that. So when we developed COMPASS, 50 centers work on it with us. Everybody had to give up IP. Everybody. You couldn't do the study unless you did. And Washington University was the first academic center to say yes. I'll tell you, it was a year of a lot of field work trying to get people to say yes. And now with John's great program that he'll tell you about, that data is going into the public domain. We have built a pre-competitive consortium with our pharma partners, and we're going to continue to move things much, much faster. So I'm going to summarize by telling you that I work with so many patients. Patients don't know that data's not shared. They don't know. So on the first panel, when you said, how do you change the culture? If patients knew how long it took to publish, if they knew it's your tissue, it's your data, it's your life, believe me, the patients will be the first force to start really changing the culture and backing everybody around open access.
So let me begin by saying it's been an honor to work with Kathy over the years.
Thank you.
I'm an emotional
John.
guy, and I hear her story, and I start to think about the challenges she faces, and what an honor it's been to work with such a force of nature. So I guess that's where I start. But everybody's talked about data, right? And we hear about big data, but data in and of itself has no real value. Right? It's a big pile of stuff. How do you actually make sense of it? And let me explain why this is so important in biomedical research. Our bodies are made of cells. Every cell is like a little machine made of proteins. The blueprints for making those proteins are encoded in our genes. That's in our DNA, our genome. Okay? And if I were to take anyone's genome in this room and sequence it, right, I could tell you a few things. I could tell you about your ethnicity. You probably know that. I could tell you about your gender. You definitely know that. Right? I could tell you if you have sticky earwax, but you have a very cheap test for that. The things that I can tell you that are medically relevant are limited. But if I were to take your genome, and if I knew, say, you had colon cancer, and I sequenced your tumor genome, and I discovered there was a mutation in a gene called KRAS, I could tell your physician not to treat you with a drug class called EGFR inhibitors because it won't work. Okay? The point is that context is everything. And so a few years ago, my partner Mick Carell and I were looking at this explosion of data that you've heard a number of people talk about in genomics, our ability to generate just massive quantities of information. And we realized that that information in and of itself had no real value. It had limited value, but not the potential tremendous value that it had. We realized that for the data to actually be useful and used, there was something more that needed to be done. We needed to put it into context. But we also had to create the resources and tools to make that data available. Now, we've all heard about grant funding from the National Institutes of Health, and we know how difficult it is, and the budget's been declining. And the bottom line is getting people to invest in building infrastructure has been extraordinarily hard. So Mick and I said, well, look, we're not going to be able to do this here. Let's create a company, Genospace, and the goal of that company is going to be to try to address those questions. How do we take data and information and make it useful? How do we make it and present it in a way that not just a quantitative geek like me, but my mom could look at the data and make some kind of inference from it? right? How do we actually make the data useful and accessible? But we realized that dealing with genomic data is very different. If I were to take your genome, you probably wouldn't want it available to everybody, right? What if you had a risk allele for schizophrenia or something else? So we realized one of the core things we had to think about, even when we're talking about open data, is data security. How do we protect it? How do we store it in such a way, though, that people can still use it while it's protected? So we started building tools and resources to do that, and then we looked for partners. And you've heard people talk about incentives, and Kathy said it really well. The people with the incentive to share data and make it available are the people whose lives are on the line, the patients themselves. And so when we launched the company, we went looking for partners. And I can tell you we couldn't have found a better partner than Kathy and the team at the MMRF. Because we walked into the room with them, we sat down, and we talked exactly the same language. We told exactly the same story. We talked about how this phenomenal study they were going to do was only going to be really valuable if we could take it and put it in the context of clinical information, and we could create tools that will allow anyone to access it and answer questions. And so we've been working with Kathy and her team on creating this researcher portal that's available pretty competitively, and we're going to be talking about some other things we're going to be doing both with the portal and other things later.
Our next champion, Jerry Ostreicher, is no stranger to being celebrated. He's actually a recipient of the National Medal of Science. But today, he's here representing the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. Please tell us a little bit about Sloan.
So we've been all talking about the things the way we all do about each other and our happinesses and sadnesses. Astronomers are a bit odd. They don't look
None
at
of the
each
other people here are odd at all.
and look around at each other or look down. They look up. They look up at the whole rest of the universe, and there's not many of them, so there's an awful lot of sky per square astronomer. So how was this done? How was this done in the past? So when I was young, you would have an astronomer who would compete to get time at one of the big telescopes, and this had been the same since the Renaissance. And if they got the time, they would have some clever project which they wouldn't tell anyone about, and they would get the data, and then bring it back, put it in their desks, carefully analyze it, hope and try to keep anyone else from using that telescope for a similar project, and then finally publish the results when they could get it and get famous. Well, that worked very well, but slowly. Now let me fast forward to 1989. Jim Gunn, who's back in the audience, came to my office and said, you know, he was a fantastic instrumentalist. He said, you know, we have electronic detectors now which work 50 times better than photographic plates. And we could put them on telescopes and survey the whole sky, not just once, but again and again. We'd find all kinds of stuff. And it would be much, much better than anything that's been done before. And it was a very brief conversation. I knew he could build it. He'd built instruments for Palomar. I said, Jim, if you build it, I'll see. If you can build the technology, I'll see that it's done. So then we worked with Don York, Al Sinisgalli, Michael Strauss, Jill, other people who were in the audience. And within 2 years, we had a project. It was the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. And we set it up. There was money from outside. We now had lots of people. But we had to write some principles of operation. And here's what they were. It was a huge fight, not with the people I'm mentioning, but with the outsiders at first. The principles were, instead of doing it the old way, everyone had to share all their data with everyone else on the project instantly. Now that meant the incentives were all of a sudden completely changed. Now it meant that in the past I might not have been unhappy if your instrument didn't work, because then I'd get more time. Now if your instrument doesn't work, I don't get your data. And so we would all work on each other's. The incentives were changed, and everyone worked together, got much, much more out of it. But there was another part. In 2 years, it was all going to be made public, in less than 2 years. Everyone who joined it was going to so I couldn't put it at my desk and just keep everyone else away. All of a sudden, the incentive was for me to get it out. and in fact to have collaborators outside. Well, that's the story. Now let me tell you the results. It all worked. We found.
Thank you very much.
I'll be very quick to tell you. So we have 70 terabytes of data, 5,000 refereed publications, 200,000 citations. We found the most distant quasars, the faintest star, mergers in our galaxy, largest sample of galaxies. Incredible results. And we even use the public. There is a galaxy zoo where vast numbers of people can see galaxies and classify them, ordinary citizens. So the whole thing has worked, and it's been imitated. It is interesting, we were talking on the way here, there are astronomical projects which have not imitated us. I won't say their name. And they're doing it in the old way with results that might be imagined. But there is going to be a successor project, LSST, which I'll talk about in the announcement, which we hope will be a terrific successor. Thank you.
Fantastic. Will, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm a rare book guy, a very rare book guy. And on the 19th of January 1998, someone left on my desk a moldy old 13th century prayer book.
As one does.
As one does. And the thing is that the prayer book was made out of parchment, cow skin, goat skin. But this had been reused goat skin, and it was used a second time. And the first time it had been used by a scribe who'd written treatises by Archimedes, and these had been scraped off. It was in very bad condition. It was in medieval Greek, and it clearly needed scientific imaging. And this was fantastic for me, because I was completely useless at any of these things. And this was an open science project to the extent that right from the beginning, I was open to any suggestion. And we tried freaking everything, MRIs, confocal microscopy, optical character recognition. We ended up using multispectral imaging and going to the Stanford Synchrotron Radiation Laboratory to use X-ray fluorescence imaging to image through a forgery onto a piece of 10th century cow skin with erased Archimedes text on it, and we got our results. And then we released all our raw data on the internet under a Creative Commons license in machine-readable format for anyone else to post-process exactly as they liked. I think the really important thing about this is that so far we've basically, with the exception of Eric's wonderful presentation, been talking about science in isolation from the humanities. And this is going to break down, and everything that Dr. Holdren said right at the beginning of this talk about opening up stuff in the sciences can equally said about the humanities. And the humanities have a huge amount to learn from you people because we're still way behind the curveball, but we're trying. Anyway, what I really found out about this is from the processed images that resulted as a part of this, I realized that the digital data actually had an intrinsic value above and beyond that of the manuscript data. So it dignified the digital data, and I suddenly realized that the digital data was really, really important in its own right. And as a curator of illuminated manuscripts at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, I took that seriously, and I created machine-readable digital data sets of all the manuscripts that I could, thanks to fantastic funding from the NEH and a wonderful crew of people. So that's all out there on the net, and frankly, it's by far the most accessible medieval manuscript data in the world, and that's what I did.
How many manuscripts have you put up?
About 300, spanning the 8th century to the 19th. We did it. First of all, we did the Islamic world. Then we did the Greek Orthodox world, England, Holland, Germany. We're moving on to France. The trouble is that I feel like a bit like I've been sold the first telephone. I don't have anyone to play with. So I've changed jobs to bust another data set, and that's I'm now the Director of Special Collections at the University of Pennsylvania, where we'll be doing exactly the same thing. Thank you.
And for those of you who don't think there's any science in the humanities, watch Will's TED Talk. It is astonishing the amount of science that is going into the work that he's doing. It really is a remarkable project. Atul Butte from Stanford, please.
Great, thanks. I want to point out to the people in the back on the webcast that there are a lot of kids in this audience. And if I were a kid, I'd probably be bewildered here because we're taught in kindergarten how to share, and the rest of us grown-ups have to come to the White House to learn how to do this. So I just want to echo John's point and just riff off of that. I think we are in an amazing time now that 10 years after the Genome Project, we have these amazing tools that let us get a handle on all these molecules in our cells, get us to know our bodies better. I always bring a prop. This is like one of these kinds of chips because data is physical too. It comes from physical devices like this. And these only cost a couple $100 or $1,000, whether it's a sequencer or a chip like this, gets us amazing numbers of molecules from diseases, from healthy people. And all those molecules are measured by scientists that were keeping all this data in their own universities until journals and then funding agencies and now White House policy makes us share that data through the internet. And I think David Lippman was being very modest. His data banks grow like crazy. His banks are doubling every other year. My checking account makes 1% interest. I wish my banks grew like his banks. They're amazing return on investment there. And so what's amazing to me now is, fast forward to just even this morning, we have 1.25 million of these chips publicly available right now. And that's a number, but what does that number actually mean? You or me or a high school kid can go to one of David's repositories or others around the world, get a handle on, type in breast cancer, and now as of this morning, download 38,000 digital samples of breast cancer from 1,500 different labs around the world who have done these experiments using these latest tools. So that's like getting 1,500 of the best labs in the world to study breast cancer for you and give you their results. Kids today would call that crowdsourcing, right? Go recruit help from the internet to get your job done. In the old days, we used to call that Tom Sawyer, getting your friends to paint the fence for you. But I think open data is best described as retroactive crowdsourcing, right? The crowd of top scientists is already helping you. You don't even know it, and they don't even know it. But the data is available for free. It costs so relatively little to make those scientific measurements publicly available on the internet, and my use of open data doesn't impact your use of open data. So in that way, it's an ultimate public resource. It's renewable. It's an amazing platform for development. I think it's better than oil or diamonds to invest in some ways, right? So instead of now being limited by the capabilities of any one lab or the restrictions on any one lab, we can see what's in common across dozens or hundreds or thousands of different labs and see what they're getting in common, what they would call the wisdom of the crowd. So in my lab, we try to package this wisdom from publications and open data, some of which yield diagnostics, some of which we can even spin out as companies. For example, in pregnancy diagnostics, a company called Carmenta, or trying to crowd-source the wisdom of geneticists into understanding patients better through their DNA, in a company called Personalis. I'm now proud to be a new principal investigator for an initiative from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, NIAID, called IMPORT, working with Jeff Weiser and others at Northrop Grumman, collaborators at Stanford. And we're trying to release the next generation of open data, what I think is going to be an amazing new release on open clinical trials data, something that is really hard to get to. Half of clinical trials fail and thus never even make it into a publication. So imagine now how we can run meta trials of the future, comparing one drug against another. Or maybe the physician of the future can deliver precision medicine by having an app that's powered by raw clinical trials data. And now imagine the kid of the future writing those apps for decision support based on that power. But I'm just going to end. We were told to talk about impactful stories. I'm going to talk about my best example of an impactful story. The story starts with molecular data generated by great scientists studying diseases and drugs with federal grants. The data was open to the internet due to journal and NIH requirements. The tools to process that data were funded by federal grants. The students that worked on that data were funded by federal training grants. And then we realized that drug data and disease data can go hand in hand. And we find that we can reuse some of those drugs that we're familiar with in the clinic to find new uses or repurpose those drugs to treat otherwise hard to treat diseases in the clinic. An immigrant student comes to the United States, graduates with a PhD, gets an H-1 visa, then becomes a citizen. She launches a startup company on this drug repositioning concept. It's called NewMedi. She becomes the CEO. And then with the pilot data, she gets initial funding from the ARA stimulus funds, hires a half a dozen folks, and now gets venture capital funding this year and is launching a company that will deliver new therapies to patients. Somewhere along the line, I'm lucky enough to marry this amazing woman, Ginny Deshpande, in the front of the audience here. And all of this gets developed in about 5 years. So here's the point. New treatments, new discoveries, new science, and new jobs all launched from open data. So I'm lucky to be here. I'm thrilled to be here. I have to thank my wife, obviously, my partner for the rest of my life, my daughter Kimmy, who inspires my work, my family for funding my education, and my lab at Stanford watching this. Of course, Stanford for being an amazing platform for discovery, my collaborators, the funding agencies, and venture capitalists. But I think all of us, I'm going to thank on behalf of everyone here, thank all those scientists who do successfully share their data with the public and have created the tools and standards to do so. They're not all here in this room. And of course, the taxpayers who fund this work and should now start to expect that this work be open.
Thank you again to all of you. So along the lines of what we've been talking about, you and a number of other people have been talking about clinical data and access to that clinical data. A lot of people, when they hear about the sharing of clinical data, talk about concerns of privacy. How do we start to handle those concerns? And how do we actually encourage patients to contribute their data in meaningful ways to research so that we can actually start to continue to drive the kinds of successes that we're seeing here?
Okay. So I think that, we talked about this earlier in sort of the first panel. When you're a patient and you're living with a fatal disease, you don't lie awake and wonder what happens with my data. And I think if patients understand the role they can play in personalizing their own risk-taking abilities. And there was something, it was one of David's papers that talked about, we all do this when we work with our banks. There's certain information that we're always giving out when we go online, and there's certain information that we always keep private. And in a future world, that's what patients are going to do. So when you start talking with the patients and you ask them, would you be willing to share your information? It just depends on the patient, and it depends on how much they'd be willing to give. For someone like me, I'm an identical twin. The disease of myeloma skews in my family. My grandfather had it. My identical twin does not. I am crazy not to be published, not to have every abstract at ASH and ASCO, and I've done it. So is my twin. Biopsies, whatever we need. Put it in the public domain. I know everybody's not going to be like me, but even if you get us half of your information, we're making progress, and we can start to match you with the right types of researchers and clinicians that care.
So the trick is empowering patients to make the decision themselves.
And let them pick their privacy settings, because there's certain things we don't care about sharing, and there's certain things that might make some people nervous, but we all have different risk profiles. Leave it in the hands of the patient.
So, and I think that's really important, that technological solutions can actually help get us to the point where people feel comfortable sharing data, right? I mean, we have solutions now for sharing financial information like eBay, right? Where you feel that your credit card data is secure, yet you're able to create fiscal transactions. In the same way, if we think about the kind of genomic data we have, if I have someone who comes to me and is interested in understanding their breast cancer risk, and they want to know if they have a BRCA1 mutation, and they want people to analyze their data because maybe they have a rare mutation nobody's seen yet, they want to disclose their BRCA1 data for a very important reason. But they don't necessarily want someone to know whether or not they have a mutation in a gene called ApoE that increases their risk for Alzheimer's, because maybe their employer, if they see that information, won't want to promote them or give them a job. So there are technical solutions that have to be imposed and layered on top of the data to actually provide the kind of security and access that makes people feel comfortable. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, it's really the patients who want to see this information shared. And I can tell you story after story about patients coming into my lab at Dana-Farber and seeing the kinds of research that we're doing and just asking, well, how can I be involved? How can I get my data into the system? And how can I be sure that everybody who has the chance to see it, with a reasonable chance of doing something useful with it, can see it?
Jerry and Will, perhaps you can address this as well. People have talked about big fights that have happened over the requirement for sharing data. How do we actually get to a point where we can get beyond the big fights and get to the point where we can have a rational discussion about where data sharing will be most valuable? How do we get there?
Well, I think people love to play by the rules, and you just set up rules so that they have incentives to share rather than incentives to hog. And it's rather easy to do. And I gave examples of once the rules were set up, people were quite happy to play by these rules, and all of a sudden they wanted to share. And all of a sudden they wanted to share in a small group and then share in a bigger group because
Well-
it was to their advantage too.
Will, you're completely out on a limb in your field, in opening up data and opening up manuscripts as well. How are you trying to, or how are you seeing the opportunities for driving more data sharing in your field?
Yeah, I don't think I'm quite as alone as you characterize.
Oh,
There are
great.
other- there are
Oh, you're
other
the one who
people
said you had a
doing- other people-
telephone and no
other
one
people
else
doing fantastic stuff. But I would say that in my field, the real problem is that people simply don't know what open data looks like. And this is a fundamental and rather interesting problem. I mean, very briefly, the promise of the digital revolution is that you didn't have to go to a library, you could see the stuff on the web. And this appeared totally miraculous. You don't have to go to the British Library to see the London Swan Gospels. You can just turn it and plug it on the machine. So everyone built their data so that they could put it in portals so that they could instantly see it on their desktop. But that's just building a virtual portal of the British Library in the sky, and it doesn't help you actually fulfill the promise of data, which is to integrate data sets, because the data of the future isn't going to be built by institutions. The interfaces are going to be built by people who have questions that they want to ask. And this sort of interface, these interfaces that these libraries developed are antithetical to that idea. And so people have to really relearn how to release their data in truly sustainable and interoperable ways. And it's a straightforward education lesson. That's the main problem we've got to face, I think.
That's a nice transition to the announcement that you were going to make today.
Yeah. So there are many distinguished physicians here today. One that didn't make it was a guy called Galen. He died around the year 200. And he was hugely important for over 1,000 years. And he wrote a text called On Simple Drugs. And by the quirk of manuscript transition, the Syriac translation of this is hugely important. And it exists in 2 copies, a very partial little pamphlet in the British Library of about 6 folios, and about 250 folios of a palimpsest that the team that worked on the Archimedes palimpsest have now digitized multispectrally and put up the data set and all the raw data on the internet for free at, ready for it, www.digitalgalen.net. That's the fun thing. All the raw data's out there, and all you Galen fans out there, if you have the thrill of wanting to read what Galen wrote, then please find your local image processor and tell him to have at it. This is absolutely what we want to happen, and it's one of the more influential figures of medicine in the world, and we're trying to read him. Thank you very much.
Well, I have a couple of announcements, but time is short, and so I think I won't make one about the Digital Sky Survey, but the successor to that, or the telescope we hope will be the successor, LSST, Large Synoptic Survey Telescope. It's in the President's budget, but as you all know, being in the President's budget is not sufficient for it to happen. It's 8.2 meter. It will be in a dark site in Chile, if and when it's built, and it'll basically go out to 100 times fainter, reaching the edges of the observable universe. SDSS was nearby galaxies. There's some contributions from NSF and DOE and some from private individuals, and the results will be instantly available to everyone. So the example given to me by Michael Strassers here was that if this is built, when it's built, school children will have the opportunity, for example, to be the first to discover a new supernova that was found the night before by turning on the computer, getting it, and finding this out.
That is remarkable. Thank you.
Let's hope it happens.
Kathy and John, you talked about empowering patients. What's the next thing you're going to do to empower patients?
So I talked to you a little bit about the fact that we were launching a study following 1,000 patients over time and sequencing their genomes, and then putting all of that data out into the public domain for the entire research community to use, anybody, everybody, that wants to look at that data. And by the way, the data that we generate on Compass, you find different genomic information, but it ties to other cancers. So these are not just multiple myeloma gateways, they are cancer gateways. But the most important thing for John and me was we said if we were doing all this work and we didn't bring it home to the patient in the clinic, we have not finished the cycle. So what we've now opened is a patient gateway in which if we find, and we will, on our Compass study and in our genomic hypotheses and working with our researchers that translocation of 414 is critically important. On our patient gateway, we are building sub-communities of all of these patients. Call them P53, call them a certain translocation. We're bringing these patients together where we can post the trials, post the research, tell them everything they need to know by scientific experts so that we can get the clinical trial matching piece done faster and we can develop faster, more efficient clinical trials that FDA will like. And that will close the loop and make John and me feel like we made a bigger difference for our patients.
Part of what's
Yeah.
part of what's so exciting about this too is the Compass study is 1,000 patients. We're following them over 5 years. We're seeing evolution in action as the disease is treated with different drugs. And we really want to try to understand that process. But it's 1,000 patients. There are 10,000 patients diagnosed every year in the U.S. with myeloma. And if in 2 years we had 20,000 patients, in 5 years we had 50,000 patients, our power to be able to discover something that's meaningful and useful just expands exponentially. And for me, this is just a really exciting opportunity, not only to help drive research, but then also, as Kathy suggested, to be able to give information back to the patients so that it's not just scientists and physicians who can interpret it, so that they have an active role in interpreting the data and information that's available.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you both. So, Jack, you used open access to publications to help drive your extraordinary discovery. What's next for you?
So what's next for me is I'm essentially launching a petition on change.org with a group of other high school students that is essentially expressing our discontent with these paywalls because one of the real problems with being young is you don't really have a voice in your government, and administrations come and go. However, our generation is kind of here to stay, and the decisions of the government today will really dictate our careers and lives tomorrow. And so that's why I really want to be able to give children and teens their voice in their government and be able to rule in on the important issue of open access. And by signing this petition, they're going to be telling the government that, hey, we don't really like these, but hopefully we can make a compromise between entrepreneurship and then also open access to hopefully solve this problem.
Thank you, Jack. And in between graduate high school and get a driver's license. Totally. Tell me about it. So we have had an extraordinary group of people here, but something that we wanted to point out is when we went through this process of calling for nominations for Champions of Change on open data and open science and open access to publications, we got in a huge number of responses. It was remarkable. And it was quite a daunting task to go through it. The truth is that we probably could have named an order of magnitude more people who have had an extraordinary effect on open science and open data across a number of different areas. Some of them will be presenting posters upstairs today. Others are not being directly recognized today, but it really is extraordinary. Your leadership in this space has really made a difference for the world, and we want to encourage everyone to continue to drive in this space. We have certainly the administration is committed to continue to drive in this space, and with your help, I'm sure we'll be able to make a lot more progress. What I'd also like to do is invite again everyone to attend the poster session and reception upstairs in the Indian Treaty Room on the 4th floor. We have people who will escort you up there. The poster session and reception is co-sponsored by the Mozilla Foundation and Mozilla Science Lab, which just launched last week This is an extraordinary nonprofit organization that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. But we want to thank them for co-sponsoring the poster session upstairs. And last but not least, every single person in this room has had an interaction with a wonderful woman who works in our office, Angelica Diogerkar, who in the corner there. We want to thank Angelica for a tremendous amount of work over the last couple months to make all of this happen today, and so we all owe her for making this all happen. Thank you all again. All the champions, please come up to the stage so we can get a picture while everyone else goes upstairs, and we'll meet you all up there. Thank you again.